have this little history that, we used to have a Chinatown here. That blows my mind. I never even knew about that it's possible to have a Chinatown in a little area that has 2,300 people. Everybody knows the West has a long history with the Chinese. And so does Jacksonville. People were here, then they were gone. Why? Very simple, because of discrimination.
In 1966, the National Historic Preservation Act really came about from a lot of things that were going on at the time in the 60s and the late 50s, where you had highway departments and other federal agencies like the Urban Renewal Agency that were doing a lot of development in historic areas. That led to a lot of demise of historic places, and eventually the public really asked for the senators to write some sort of bill together that would help protect some of these historic places from the federal agencies that were working on them. So out of this act came Section 106, which is about 150 words. And within the act itself, there's about 30 words that actually make a difference. And those 30 words essentially suggested that any federal action should consider historic places, sites, buildings, objects, structures, districts. And so Jacksonville being a National Historic Landmark and historic district, when we have projects in Jacksonville, we're considering our actions vis-a-vis the actual historic district. As it turns out, we are putting a walkway through really the earliest and one of the most intact Chinese settlements in the Pacific Northwest. So we had archaeology involved, we had historic preservation involved. Our role really was helping sort out how the project can really have a net positive effect on the historic district.
In the fall of 2013, as part of a sidewalk project running through the oldest part of Jacksonville, we uncovered the remains of a house that burned at 3 a.m. Tuesday morning, September 11th, 1888. This house is a time capsule. We know that it was occupied by one or more Chinese residents of the Jacksonville Chinese Quarter during a critical time in American history. And there's not a lot known about what it was like to be a Chinese individual during that time period. So this house provides us with the unique opportunity to shed light onto this really dynamic era and the social processes that were happening within it. And that means, what was daily life like for Chinese individuals living in the American West? And so these remote outposts, like the gold rush town that is now Jacksonville, really provide a lot of critical information about the history of the Chinese immigrant diaspora that's relevant on a local, regional, and national, and even international level.
There was a large population of Chinese miners in Jacksonville and vicinity in the 19th century. And because Chinese were, in many respects, not allowed to own property or to participate in the mainstream economy or politics, a lot of the history of those folks is submerged, and it comes to light through archaeology.
The Chinese miners came to Jacksonville to mine for gold and hopefully advance their economic interests, but they were excluded from owning new mining claims. And they received a lot of negative feelings for coming in after a mining claim was abandoned and just reworking old claims. And it was felt that they weren't contributing anything.
The Chinese immigrants living in the American West are an under and often misrepresented population in the historical literature. A lot of what we know about them is because of the restrictive legislation that was meant to limit their ability to own land, to get married, to vote, to own, to own businesses. And the danger in that is the history has been largely defined by the limitations of these people, and that is certainly not a service to the experiences of these individuals that helped build the West.
This is all important because it is all part of our shared history. This is the history of the places that we live. And in order to understand how we got to where we are, we need to know what happened before.
Well, we found evidence of the Jacksonville Chinese Quarter, and that was really exciting because to date, there's maps and there's historical interviews that it was there, but there's no longer any buildings that actually exist from that period and that were clearly associated with the Chinese. And so this was the first real evidence we had that, here's where they lived, and they left things that can tell us about their lives, their daily lives, and they're kind of a footnote to the history of Jacksonville. And actually, when you look back through the history, there was a large population there. They played a large role in the growth and development of Jacksonville and Jackson County, and so this gives us a chance to more fully represent their story and more accurately represent it.
So when we worked on this project, what we first recognized was ash, just regular old ash. And so we weren't surprised because we knew this was a fire. But as we went down, we found so many artifacts and in interesting patterns throughout the soil, which started to help us figure out we were onto something special. And one of the benefits of doing archaeology in a small town like Jacksonville is you can walk down the road and knock on the door of the fire department and ask the fire inspector to come help, and that's what I did. And it turns out, not surprisingly, modern day fire science can really contribute a lot to archaeological sites. So we were able to kind of do forensics on this house, how it burned, and this was a pile of ashes. So even though it was well over 100 years old, it was in a lot of ways similar to a house that would burn today, meaning that heat signatures on artifacts, we could figure out how the fire behaved throughout this house based on the way the artifacts were altered, like where things within this excavation were totally melted, where things were intact. And so what that's allowed us to do is to start to rebuild the furniture. So we know we have maps of where the house was. We have an illustration that shows a somewhat romanticized version of the house. So now we're figuring out the floor plan because we have the good luck of coming down right at a doorway. So we have intact floorboards, and then we have some kind of either outside or other part of the house where there's stone, like flagstone flooring. So that orients us within the house. And so then we're using the artifacts to rebuild the furniture. We know that one wall had some kind of really densely packed shelf because there's soy sauce or, spouted jars that would have contained soy sauce or fish oil. There's the dishes that would have been used to eat out of. There's cans and jars of pickled and preserved stuff that would have been imported from China, and certainly some locally available foods. There's, in another part of the house, the way I like to think about it is there was a table that had maybe a game as somebody left it when they went to bed that night, because we have gaming pieces and tokens and coins and all those things really in this one part of the house. And they're really heat altered because if you have something out on a table with the air and the oxygen and the way a fire burns, it would be more vulnerable to being burned than something inside a cupboard. So all those kind of techniques we've been using to try to go back in time, to use this as a time capsule. And again, as archaeologists, we're time travelers. We are interpreters of this material culture. So we can use the tools of our trade to try to help illustrate what this would have looked like before this fire happened.
So I actually got to work a little bit in the field on the Jacksonville dig. I get to figure out what plant remains from different archaeological sites actually are. So charcoal, seeds, pollen, starches, they all have diagnostic characteristics about them. So you can look at them under the microscope and figure out different species and different taxa. Sort of through this forensic investigation of the wood and charcoal, we can figure out what the house might have looked like when it was originally constructed. Now it's my job to sleuth out and see exactly what this floorboard material was made out of. And I can do that by looking at the diagnostic characteristics in the cross-section of the wood. This wood is definitely a softwood, so a conifer. I can tell by looking at the way the growth rings are set up. And when I focus in and I can see the smaller details, I can tell that this is pine wood. Even though maybe most people don't think of wood as being that cool of an artifact, when you actually figure out what type of wood you're looking at, it gives you a lot of information about how different resources were used in the daily life of people. So these people had oak furniture, for example.
And you said you've had a teapot like this before?
Yes, I've had this teapot, and even though it's broken and shipped in the same place, you hesitate to give it away or to throw it away, because I just love the beauty of its form. Your lab is bringing in, the everydayness of these objects are important. And in the past, if you didn't have like a dragon, and silk clothing, that kind of history was unimportant. And I know for myself, of actually seeing the objects really makes a difference, of this connection of culture between things that were practiced, tools that were used then that are still being used today. I think the thing is that, in terms of the actual objects that come out, that you definitely need the interpretation for people's voices to actually explain or tell about it. In terms of the razor being used for the queue, I remember my mom talking about, her father-in-law coming to the U.S. and they had to have a queue in those days. And he said he hated it because, the Americans would go down the street and grab him by his queue and kick his butt, and he hated that.
So our excavations at the Jacksonville Chinese Quarter site resulted in the recovery of more than 30,000 artifacts. And these are dishes, bottles, cans, furniture, everything. And we have 50 pounds of animal bones, which is what people were eating. We've got seeds, we've got plant remains. And this vast assemblage helps us to tell the story of life in a single household more than 100 years ago. And who could have guessed the extent of this bonanza that's been buried beneath the streets of Jacksonville?
As the ODOT archaeologist, we knew that we had a town that was rich in history, rich in archaeological sites. I looked at this, the State Historic Preservation Office database, and it was basically littered. The whole town is basically a site and a National Historic Landmark to boot. And so I thought, this is going to be an interesting project. And so, yes, we hit the Chinese house, a structure, and numerous other resources that were also in our project. So with the Section 106 process, we knew we had to take into account the historic resources. That's part of our responsibility. Garner the information from the local historical societies and informants and incorporate that into a research plan. I think it's important that we have Section 106 to make sure sites like this are discovered, properly interpreted, and hopefully preserved if need be, or mitigated for their impacts. And it's shared with the greater audience.
So the National Historic Preservation Act is like a gift to future Americans. Not only does it place value on historic buildings and archaeological sites, but it also provides an opportunity for experts to go in and record this data before it's lost, or to save the data from being lost. And that's basically adding to our library of knowledge. And if we don't know what came before us, if we don't understand our shared history, both as immigrants to America, as citizens of America, as indigenous Americans, as human beings, then we're really losing out on a lot of opportunities to understand what it is to be human, to understand how people interact with each other.
As a graduate student in archaeology, I did not think I'd find myself working for the Department of Transportation. A lot of times people say, well, what are you doing with ODOT? How does that interface with archaeology? And because of that Section 106 process in the National Historic Preservation Act, I'm able to explain to them, it's like, wetlands or biology or all the resources it's taken into account in our projects. It's just part of the process and allows us to preserve the heritage.
Jacksonville would be nothing if we didn't have the history here. The historical preservation efforts, the citizens here, they were able to take advantage of the act and band it together to fight off an interstate highway that was going to come through town. All of that for the purpose of preserving this town. In the meantime, they created an economy. We have a thriving tourist economy with the music festivals, with now the wine country. People come here, they have so many things to do, so many things to learn, and you know, as just local residents, we're very happy about it.
Over the past 50 years, our partnership with ODOT, which because of the National Historic Preservation Act, is the largest funder of archaeological research in the state. There is much about the history of this place that we would not otherwise know that we now know.
You know, we're translators, I guess, to the past. We come in and we can interpret what these sites mean, because artifacts and features left in the landscape represent choices made by people who came before. And those choices, when you add them all together, that's what makes the human experience. And these laws allow us to record it, to capture it, to save it for the future.